Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And as sort of mentioned at the start, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to create a psychological workplace and how belonging plays into that. And originally, part of the reason I'm here, I'm the CEO and founder of Culture Amp. Actually, I'll jump to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about why are the two of us up here to talk to you today. My name's Didier. I'm the CEO and founder at Culture Amp. And we're here as a sponsor, so if you came in and you got some of those belonging badges, does anyone, yeah, I can see some of them in here. And if you've had a chance to play with our little rope thing, where we get to help understand different ways that people construct their identities and the different things that matter to them, and it's always a fascinating process, and this is something that we've done at a whole bunch of events all over the world. And so the team came to me and said, hey, we're going to be part of this, we're a big believer in mental well-being, we see what Support Act's doing. This whole conference is a really interesting, important thing. Would I do a keynote? Could I share some of our learning from our data, working with lots of companies all over the world? And so I said, yes, I'd love to. I am currently running a software company. Prior to this, I worked for Hollywood, so I spent 13 years in film doing computer-generated imagery. I ended up as the CEO of Rising Sun Pictures. I'm on the board of the National Gallery of Victoria, or the Council of Trustees. And I used to be on the board of Slingsby and Brink. So art, my mum is an artist, and art and all of its forms has been a really powerful part of my life, so I was very, very happy to come along. But when they asked me to do the presentation, I started thinking about what I might present. I actually thought there's somebody in my life who's a lot more knowledgeable on these two topics than me, and that is Greta. Greta is my wife, but also one of the people that helped me come to the ideas that led to Culture Amp. But when we start talking about performing arts, when we start talking about well-being, when we start thinking about the intersection of those two, that's an area that, you know, I'm often talking to you about. So, Gretz, what's your background? Introduce yourself to the crowd. I'm not sure you need to, but please do.
I was
and
a bit like...
this is a first. We've never presented together on stage.
And I'm like, really? You don't want to hear from me? You probably, you know, like if you've heard of me from me before, then, you know, and if you haven't, either way, you want to hear from Dids and, you know, what he has to say. But I am really, I mean, I'm like hat off to Support Act for putting on this, you know, extraordinary conference, and it is just the beginning. So for me, my story, I mean, I'm a performing artist. Released 2 albums with Sony, 2 with Universal Music on the Decca label, all #1s, yay. Please, you know, like. But speaking of, I don't know, I have my privilege badge here somewhere, because I do feel like I wear a lot of privilege. Everyone has a story, though. I think it's really important to, you know, remember that. So I broadcast on the ABC. I present Weekend Brunch on ABC Classic, so I'm on ABC Classic 8 hours a week. I'm a psychologist, and I pitched and then helped roll out, design the Arts Wellbeing Collective for Arts Centre Melbourne. So I'm a big believer in, you know, in what we can do. I sit on the Creative Economy Task Force and have advocated pretty bloody hard around Support Act behind the scenes, alongside many other incredibly passionate folks in the industry who deeply believe in the power of Support Act. And yeah, here to talk today about belonging, talking with Dids, and Dids is going to take us through some of the sort of the insights from Culture Amp. And I think you know, one of the things that will become, I think, clear, and that I've really advocated for, and in the conversations that I've had with arts workers, be it artists, be it tech workers, be it admin workers, folks in the arts, you know, we are passionate, dedicated, extraordinary people, and people are people. So I think the data that Culture Amp kind of bears out is really interesting and insightful for our industry, be it from your customers who are from within the arts, like orchestras and arts orgs who use Culture Amp, but also from outside the arts, and, you know, other humans walking this journey too.
So let's go on this journey together. As Greta just said, we're going to start. I'm going to share a little bit about Culture Amp and just a little bit of the data that we have that might be useful, that really thinks about the world of work as a whole. And then what we're going to dive into is really this concept of belonging. And we're going to look at what it means and how it works and how we might think about it, and particularly how we might think about it in the context of the performing arts and the music industry, because there's probably two things that we really want to get across today. One, which is you're not alone. There are a lot of the issues that are being grappled with in the music industry are being grappled with everywhere. So that, there are things you can draw upon, there is support that you can draw upon, there are tools and techniques and approaches, but also there are things that are specific to your situation that amplify some of those. And by being aware of that, that might help us in the way we think about it. And one of the things that came out in our conversation when we were flying up yesterday and we were talking about this was even and we're going to go off piste before we even get to the first slide. When I'm working with organizations, I'm often talking to them about how to keep people at their company. Like, what does it mean to have people that want to be there for long term? How do you support them through that journey? And I think one of the things that we'll keep coming back to here is that a lot of the work in this industry is not just for a single company. And so we're not just playing to keep someone working somewhere, we're actually about playing to keep people in an industry. And we're coming off a period of time where music, as in some of the other industries, have been hit so hard, we've lost a lot of the people that used to be part of it. And we have to think really carefully about what we can do to build back from that. I don't know, Gretz, if you want to say anything on that before we get stuck in.
Well, I think we should get stuck in, Didzy.
All right, let's get stuck in.
But one thing I will, and I massacre his name as so when
She's
you
the
meet
only
him
one that's allowed
afterwards,
to.
That's not true. The diddler, Didskafly, yeah, it's all up for grabs. One thing I will say, in a whip around a piece of research that I did for the Creative Economy Task Force just a couple of months ago, not even looking at attrition in the music industry in particular and arts orgs that support the music industry, 30% of technical workers at major arts organisations in Australia have left the industry. It's just, it's full on. So I think to consider, and one of the major protective factors is belonging. So, I think what you say, Dids, is quite right. We're not looking like it's kind of a, part of the gig economy. There are a lot of people who work across a bunch of places, and to think about how we can cultivate belonging and how we can underpin the sustainability of our individual careers and the sector as a whole. Belonging is really crucial.
Yeah, all right. And we will leave some time at the end for questions as well. So we're interested in questions or reflections that people might have. So I mentioned Culture Amp. Our mission at Culture Amp is to create a better world of work. That's what drives us. When I started the company a bit over 10 years ago, we had the world's most naive business plan. So I wrote down on a piece of paper, 10,000 by 10,000 equals 100 million. If I had tens of thousands of companies spending tens of thousands of dollars, I'd have hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. We've actually passed that point now. We're a pretty decent sized organization. But years ago, we realized that you don't measure your impact in dollars. You measure your impact in people. And so we actually took that very simplistic number and we said, okay, what would it mean for us to amplify the experience and the impact of over 100 million people in the world? It's a little bit under 1% of the world's population. So how might we do that? And so that's really what Culture Amp's about. And what Culture Amp is an employee experience platform. We work with companies all over the world to help them understand what matters to their people, to do something about it, to put in place to sort of humanize the processes that they use to think about employee development, to think about performance, to think about all those different things that you might traditionally call HR. And then a big part for us, and something that we're really focused on now and going into the future, is how do we guide people on that journey? So how do we help them develop and grow in their life and organization? And so we think about it as employee experience as everything from the start to the end, every point along the way. How can we help collect the data that's needed, and how can we help use that data to make better decisions? In terms of size and scale, we work with about 5,500 companies around the world. Every size. We have a customer in Antarctica, so every continent you possibly imagine. we work with a lot of big names, ambitious brands and people that people are excited about. But a lot of the people that I get really excited about are, we work with Pixar at the high level, but also we work with Opera Australia, we work with the Arts Centre, we work with groups all over the world. And one of our very first customers, I think it was our 6th customer 10 years ago, was the Yerba Buena Community Arts Centre in San Francisco. And so along the way, it's been, really helping organisations through not-for-profits, social profits, all those different areas, sporting organisations, really grapple with the experience of their people and how do they improve it, and how do they treasure that and make it something special. And don't worry about the data on this, it's here to remind me, so you don't have to read any of this, but I just wanted to start by just anchoring us on a concept. So something we do a lot of is we work with organisations to help them understand the engagement of their people. And so what is engagement? Engagement is, are you proud to work at the place that you're working at? Would you recommend it as a place to somebody else to work at? Can you see yourself here at your organisation 2 years from now? Can you see a path for you? Are you currently looking for a job elsewhere? There's all this sophisticated technology that people are using these days to try and work out if staff are going to leave, and there's actually a lot of power in just asking them. Are you actively looking for a job elsewhere? And we obviously do a lot of the work at the back end to make this confidential, to make sure that you're not outing yourself when you answer those questions. And then the 5th question when you're looking at engagement is, am I motivated to go above and beyond what I would in a similar role elsewhere? And so we're sort of tapping into this motivation component. So there's a say, stay, strive model, which is, are you proud? Are you willing to say nice things about the place that you're at? Are you willing to stay for the longer term? And then most importantly, are you getting what you need to feel like you can put yourself into this organisation? In a traditional company, I call it the 5 o'clock test. You're about to walk out the door, the phone rings, it's a customer or something or other. Do you take the call or not? If you're not emotionally invested in the organisation, you don't. If you are, you might. And that's part of the thing that you're looking at. So when we look across all these organisations and we say, what drives engagement? What are the things that make a difference to how people feel about their organisation? They're pretty consistent across all the different industries and across all the different spaces. So you see things like being rewarded and recognised, that generally the right people are rewarded and recognised. That's one that does change. The ones that are the most important are the ones on the left. So I have confidence in leaders. If you don't have confidence in leaders, it's hard to be engaged. That your leaders demonstrate that people are important to the company's success. This is often a surprising one for some CEOs. You go and say, an important part of engagement is that your people actually have to know that you care. And it shows up time and time again. You can have companies that are very successful, but if the people that are working there don't believe that the leaders actually think that they're important for that success, it's very hard for them to be emotionally connected to it. And then we see a lot around development and making sure that resources are being effectively directed. Are we putting our bets in the right places? And these are consistent across all the different orgs. And we see at different scales, different things change. But we've done some new research that I wanted to share with you. This is not out in the open yet. We're going to be sharing it later in the year. But I think it's very relevant for what we're talking about today. Were you about to jump in on something?
It's all right, yeah, but that's all right.
No, come on.
No, go for it.
All right, we'll come back to that one then. And that is some research where we've been looking at, we looked at all of our organisations and we sort of thought about 2 different axes. So companies that are growing, so gaining, and then companies that are also able to keep the people they have. So you've got these 4 quadrants. So the companies that are growing, which is often to do with the market they're in. It's not necessarily because they're brilliant, hopefully brilliant, but it's also to do with market. Companies that are growing and able to keep their people are thriving. Companies that are not able to keep people but are also not growing are what we would call declining. And then you have the rotating and holding on either side. And the reason I share this research and why it's so interesting for today is that when we look at companies that are growing really quickly and succeeding, the number one driver of engagement is what I talked about before, which is development opportunities. People are willing to put up with the other insanity in a high growth company because they see an opportunity to grow and develop in their career. And we expected that. What we didn't expect was that when you looked at companies that were not seeing huge opportunities, so they weren't growing quickly, the number one driver of engagement is psychological safety. And so what people need from their organisations is different. And so I think when we talk today about some of the challenges that we're faced in a lot of the industries that many of you are representing, is that we are in situations where it's not like you're going to double the headcount of the organisation next year. It's not like there's massive extra opportunities. So you're sitting there going, I love doing this, I want to do this. What is it I need to be able to continue to do this. And so that's where we get to this concept of psychological safety and then into belonging. So I'm going to hand over to you, Gigi, to talk a little bit about this, because you're the person that introduced me to Brené Brown.
Yeah, well, there you go. Now he bangs on about Brené a lot, just saying. But can I just go back to the points you were making about engagement? And because I just want to kind of make a couple of comments on this. And this was one of the things that I know I've already mentioned, which is that, for a lot of us who in this room identifies, and you can just kind of raise your hand. Okay, how am I going to ask? Okay, so what I'm going to ask is about how many of you, when you think about those questions for around, say, engagement, are thinking around your individual career in the arts, like in music, most likely, or maybe some other area of the creative industries, versus how many people are thinking about this in the context of an organisation. So can you raise your hand if you're thinking about it in terms of you as an arts worker or an artist working in the industry? So it's like half, maybe a bit over half. So I think this is one of the really interesting things for us when we think about this. We're thinking about engagement in a life and in a career, not just in the sort of the typical, organisational kind of context. Either way, and I just want to call that out because, the irony of this, like when it comes to belonging, is we make sure that everyone knows, you belong in this room and in this conversation, like whether you're here representing yourself in your own career or whether you're here thinking about this in the context of an organisation. The other thing that I want to call out, though, is a really important precursor to engagement and is well-being. So, this connection between current well-being is one of the greatest predictors of future engagement in a career or in an organisational setting. So it all has to flow back to well-being. And I think the other thing to really reflect on in terms of what is really important with a declining kind of, organisational setting or with a sector under threat, as we are, as a function, be it we're thinking about funding, be it we're thinking about the impact of COVID-19 and interaction of the two, whatever we're thinking about in terms of that, we are under threat. And when we are under threat, it is at that point where psychological safety becomes really, really important. And the other thing, and the reason why we've brought along this Brené Brown quote and one other, which is kind of along similar lines but coming at it from a slightly different angle, is one of the greatest gifts that we can give. And feel free to disagree with me, but I think is to have the courage to be imperfect when we're on stage, because that's where the magic happens. And what do we need in order to feel like we can create a space where we can be imperfect? We need to trust that those around us have our back and aren't going to undermine the space that we need in order to bring that moment. And when we're thinking about that space is a space of belonging. The other thing that I want to mention just right at this moment is, the research that both Support Act is coming out with and other adjunctive research would suggest that only about 1/3 of us feel like we belong. So we can sort of unite and feel like we belong in the majority, which feel like we don't belong in this, which I think is a really powerful thing to think about. And and this theme of, in order to cultivate a culture of belonging, we need to look beyond ourselves, and rather than looking at how we feel, ask how does the person next to us feel, and how can we cultivate in this moment for them a feeling of belonging, and understand that it's both something that comes with a history and with a whole bunch of stuff in the past, but also which comes in this moment and which is situational. Anyway.
And I think this is the point where we were starting to think about this. So we were, okay, cool, these are the challenges, this is what we're seeing. And then what got really interesting, and you're going to start seeing some of this. We talked about this a little bit before in terms of what is the effect of not getting belonging right. And so this is from all of our data. So this is not to do with the music industry. This is just every company everywhere in the world looking at how people score on I feel like I belong and what effect that has on them and whether they're going to stay. So the way to read this is people that don't feel like they belong are almost 3.5 times or 3.2 times more likely to leave. And people that do belong are half as likely to leave. So there's a huge shift. If you don't belong, you don't last long. Like it takes a huge toll on you to stay in an organization when you don't feel like you belong. And so we're seeing people leave companies, we're seeing people leave industries. And so we sat down and said, okay, well, what can we share today on stage that might help you in your situation, your organizations? And one of the things we started talking about was that there's, I guess, some myths, I think, particularly in the performing arts, on what people should expect or put up with.
Yeah, one of the super cool things I think that is happening and has been happening over the last decade or so is this, we are no longer constrained by this kind of rhetoric of, well, it's just because. It's just because it is the way that it is. We're somehow we need struggle in order to be an effective artist, or somehow we're more sensitive. Yeah, we're all sensitive, but the human race is a sensitive creature, and thank you. That this is not an excuse. This is a reason that has been fed to us for so long in terms of keeping things the way they are, perpetuating this myth that somehow there's nothing to be done, that somehow it is reduced down to an issue of the individual as opposed to a function of the context and the environment that we work within. So one of the things that I think, and it's really interesting because I feel like there's a real kind of tension out there in the research at the moment. Like on the one hand, the research is continuing that, let's look at the heritable components that, pervade folks who work in the arts and try and kind of pinpoint elements of an individual that might explain some of these kind of sensitive traits. It's total bullshit. Like if you actually kind of get into it, and I love this quote from one of the professors in psychiatry at Harvard, that it's sort of part of like a much longer and more sort of nuanced conversation. But this idea of, at the end of the day, if you're trying to kind of pin this on innate traits that are somehow born out in any environment, that are sort of, like special snowflake traits of people who work within the arts, it's a simplistic kind of research. You can do it very easily and you get a lot of attention for your findings. And, I'm calling that and saying this is something that we all here in this room and Support Act are evidence that this is a contextual issue. And if there's one thing that COVID has been, as much as we wouldn't wish it on any universe, it's been really good at demonstrating that in the right and in tragic contexts, anyone will be impacted on from a mental health and wellbeing perspective. And the conditions under which so many of us work, the level of uncertainty and instability, the level of financial hardship, the level of, I suppose, just a lack of control, anyone is going to struggle. So what can we do?
Yeah, and I think this example you shared with me as well, which is, I guess, once again goes to show, because you can talk about it in terms of cohorts, this is the same people in a single cohort and the effect that essentially coming into the industry has on them.
So one of the really interesting pieces of research done by Xander et al., it's a research group, they've done a few pieces of research. It's intervention research, and what it demonstrates is that this particular research they did was looking at university students at the beginning of university, so looking at music students versus general population of students at uni. At the beginning of the university journey, the music students had better mental and physical health and wellbeing. Same as at the beginning of the second year. Around the middle of the second year, for the music students, it started to decline until by the end of the second year, and then further decline into the third year, their physical and mental health, so physical in terms of pain, but mainly the mental health components, were significantly worse, and they stayed worse. And when you actually got into the why, it was associated with their transitioning into professional life and into the pressures of professional life. The lack of certainty, using shame as a currency, as a way of sort of like covert control within the industry in a hyper-competitive industry. But the really interesting thing was when they performed group-based interventions that were around well-being strategies and around also resilience, and I have a complicated relationship with the word resilience, but I'll save that for this context. It found that their mental health and well-being status was completely ameliorated. So it went back to no difference to the general population. So this idea that somehow there are innate traits that are untreatable, that are inevitable about folks who work in the creative industries is just simply not the case. And that alongside that, you know, when we think about it, around half of people will experience a mental illness in their lifetime, and that's half of all people. And it's around about the same when you look at folks from within the creative industries.
And I think that's one of the key things that I think we want everyone to take away, which is that, as Greta said, it's not about the fact that you're an artist, therefore these things need to happen to you. They happen in ways because of the systems and the structures that we have set up, and we need to do things about those, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But there are also things that we can collectively do together that affect that. And I think this is this concept of group-based interventions and the Perma model of what are the things that the same data that shows us that we have all these bad effects, what does that research show us can actually affect that and reduce it or even improve it in the other direction? So do you want to just talk a little bit about Perma?
Yeah. Have you heard of Martin Seligman and the Perma model? So, I mean, terrible name, Perma, but it's an acronym. So positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. And this idea that when we have sort of these threads kind of covered off in one way or another of our lives, then we will experience more flourishing. And the really super cool thing in some intervention research that I did back in 2015, 16, 17 was I found that we respond really well, like folks within the arts and within music in particular respond really well to this idea of, you know, looking at how we can cultivate these different areas in our lives. So Seligman, Seligman, Martin Seligman, he's kind of the grandfather, I suppose, of positive psychology, but Perma works really well. The other one, I'm just going to give a shout out to anyone who wants kind of another kind of resource that you might like to use. Russ Harris, he's a psychologist, he's a medical doctor as well, but he's a psych. He's massive in sort of the acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, area. And he has a website called thehappinesstrap.com, and it has some really fantastic free resources, as well as a course that you can do which is paid, which is a little bit more full on, but yeah, fantastic for getting into Perma.
And I think one of the things that, and this was something that Greta taught me as I was going on my journey at Culturam, because we're applying a lot of psychological concepts to how organizations develop, and positive psychology was this real shift away from the study of disorder into the study of flourishing. So like, it wasn't about what are all the things that are wrong with us, it was about how might we better cultivate things that will positively affect us. And funnily enough, that ends up being the thing that we need to deal with a lot of the challenges. So we're kind of going round and around on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving past just, you know, because even prevention and treatment, they kind of both speak to returning us to baseline. Whereas we're all here because we want, you know, like, we want to give so much to the world. And in order to do that, we need to allow ourselves the space in the room to flourish and to do more than just recover from to baseline. and to accept that, that our mental health and wellbeing journey is going to be non-linear and it's going to be up and down, and that's actually okay. But this idea that, art does not, and this also kind of ties into that myth kind of, Marsha Linehan, who's another, she's a psychiatrist. She also has schizophrenia herself. And she's the founder of DBT, or dialectical behaviour therapy. And one of the things that she makes this great, she's also a Zen master. And from her Zen master training, she sort of developed this idea of radical acceptance. This idea that pain in life is inevitable. And I would argue that all of us kind of draw on pain and our experience with pain in our art. I certainly do, and that's kind of like something that I've heard from a lot of artists and folks kind of involved in cultivating shows. But suffering is where we sit with that pain, and it kind of seeps into our soul. And I think it's the suffering bit that we need to move past when it comes to thinking about belonging.
Well, so just when we were talking about this, the comment you made that really struck home with me is I'm a consumer of great artists rather than an artist myself, and I'd always had this sort of thing that, deep down I believe that Van Gogh or whoever, when they did that work, they were tapping into that suffering. That's what took their work to the next level. But you made the comment that actually when you look at it, their greatest work was not when they were suffering.
No, I mean, I think this is when we all know instances of, of artists, and one of the really amazing things today, I think, is that more and more of us are getting up and kind of speaking about our experience. I mean, I made the crazy decision to open up about self-harm on a 2-part Australian story. That was terrifying, but I'm really glad I did it because it allowed other people to kind of reach out and speak up in turn. I think that's that's fantastic. But this idea that people are creating during their suffering, people reflect on their pain and they create when they're well. We don't need mental ill health in order to be great artists. So how can we move past that, and how can we accept that, for us, we can pick up on the pain which is inevitable in life, and we can use that and we can integrate that in our art for ourselves and for other people, but we don't have to suffer in order to kind of make that happen.
So yeah, what are the things that you've seen people do, like through the Wellbeing Collective and other things? I know this in the next couple of slides.
Well, let's get through some slides, because I really want to hear from you more, friend. And alongside that, really just kind of open it up and get some reflections and some questions. But this idea that, for us in the arts, one of the things that myself and some other psychologists kind of talk about is this idea that we kind of rely on these 3 currencies. We have money, certainty, and purpose. And the 3 together, we are sort of, prepared to kind of accept in one balance or another. And that all of it comes back to this idea of identity. So who we are as expressed through our art, our sense of belonging, and psychological safety. So this is the Culture Amp definition of belonging. So the feeling of security and support one gets when there is a sense of acceptance, inclusion, and identity for a member of a certain group or place. And I love that definition, in part because it kind of gets to the nub of we don't all have to be the same. And I think that, when we think about the level of a feeling of not belonging, some of that comes from feeling like we are different to that group over here who belong, and we don't belong to that group. And this idea of reciprocity as being really central to belonging. So this idea of being welcome, accepted, and appreciated by those around us, but also being welcoming accepting and appreciative of those around us. So looking at this idea of how can we bring that in every moment to try and, get belonging above 33% within the industry. Do you want to add anything, Dids?
Only insofar as what we've seen in the research is that belonging as a concept, when we talked about engagement, it's a big driver of engagement to the level where actually a lot of people say it actually is engagement. Like when we're measuring whether or not you feel like you belong, that's actually measuring very similar ideas to what it means to feel emotionally connected to something. So this traditional concept of an organizational thing that we cared about, like back to Greta's point about the happiness trap, we're not trying to make people happy all the time. That's not possible. But in a work context, we want to have you feel fulfilled. We want you to feel like this is taking you in the direction you want. And increasingly what we're seeing in the research is that this idea of how you create this environment is core to that experience. And it's something that needs to be open, accessible to everyone. And it obviously dovetails a lot with the DEI work that we're doing. So when we look at organizations that are starting to understand we need to be accessible to a much broader group. But I think what we're finding is that everybody, this is true for everybody, like a lot of this stuff was swept under the carpet. Like even the whole mental well-being thing, 20 years ago, if you were in an org or if you're in a company, you're like, I hope nobody has a mental illness because I just don't want to deal with it. Whereas I think now increasingly people are like, well, everybody's dealing with something. Like if you as an organization are not leaning into that and creating a space where that stuff can be dealt with, where is it going to be dealt with? Like we have a huge opportunity in the workplace to do it. And I think this idea of how we might do this together, because I think that also goes back to the stuff like at the university, where the interventions are often group-based, not individually based, because that's what we're drawing on to actually create something to confront all of these things. It's very hard to do on your own in the corner of a room.
Yeah, totally. And one of the other things that we wanted to sort of point out was this idea of, I find this really interesting, and I don't know how many people have sort of, in this room have felt this sense of, embarrassment or rejection or, in sort of like covert kind of ways where maybe someone didn't mean to kind of make us feel this way, but somehow we feel that, and that is a lack of psychological safety. So if you're wondering, can I ask who's experienced this feeling in this room? Pretty almost, yeah, certainly most. So how can we work to try and reduce this and feel, I suppose, better as individuals? So we thought we'd work through some kind of, like what can I do as an individual, and then what about like as a team or a group? What about as an org, and what about as a sector? What do we need to be kind of working on? And this, to be honest, like I'd love to jam on this with you. So if you have any thoughts, so just kind of like store up if you have any questions or any anything around what you've seen in this for the Q&A.
Yeah, we're running short on time, so we've got like 5 minutes to go total.
Yeah.
So I think let's go through it. Questions might have to be out on the floor.
Yeah, cool. So this idea of, for the individual, I think really bringing this idea of thinking about ways that you can bring compassion, vulnerability, and acceptance kind of together in the interactions that you have with one another, and thinking about what that means in the language that you can use in order to not inadvertently make someone feel excluded. I think if there's one thing to take away from this as for the individual, it's this idea of belonging is in the eye of the beholder. And, you can be the beholder, but the person you're talking with is also the beholder. So how can we kind of cultivate this sense of belonging together? Would you add anything, Dids?
No. You keep going, because like we have only got 5 minutes, so I think it's probably better for you to give the thread, and then I can help wrap it at the end.
I tried to get him talking more, and then of course I get in my own way and his. So I think, when it comes to teams, one of the things that I would really encourage is, that walking over, like if you're so I'm an artist, so I'll speak from the perspective of an artist, walking over to the sound desk and having a conversation with, the sound folks. This idea of kind of breaking down silos, stepping into the realm of discomfort in service of belonging, stepping into the realm of vulnerability, and accepting that, the fear of rejection can come in those moments, but it's a really powerful way of stepping into belonging. I think at the organisational level, and this is where like Culture Amp comes in, I would really love to see us become more visible to more people from a funding perspective in ways that make sense to them, so that they can understand, the level of value to be had even more so in what we're doing. So looking at how when it comes to belonging, how can we use data science? How can we use what psychology can bring? And alongside that, questioning the assumptions. So if you're a leader, question the assumptions that you have around how you're doing belonging in your workplace, not just for the people on staff, but all of the freelancers and the casuals and everyone who walks through the door. I would also say on that, the idea of the trust circle and the idea of feedback circles around people who are similar to one another in some way, to get their experiences and to integrate those experiences and be really courageous in what you do as a function of that. For instance, at Arts Centre Melbourne, we had upwards of 40 workshop type conversations with people of colour artists and First Nations artists to learn more about the experiences around belonging. And they're just plain crucial conversations to have. And I think we will leave it at that and go for it, Didsy.
See, this is the fun of trying to do these two things together.
I just throw to him because I'm like, whoa,
no,
what's he going to do?
Could you go to the last slide? Because I do want to wrap up for people, because I think what's happened is we've covered, one more. Next one. There we go. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think in many ways we probably tried to be too ambitious in the stuff that we wanted to share with you. But the things that we wanted to get across is it's not just a few anecdotes. It's not just I've heard this and you should try that. There's a world of research out there that helps validate the experience that everyone's having in this industry, and also helps you realize that you shouldn't have to feel that way. There are things that we need to do. There are factors that make it worse, but there are tools and tricks and techniques and things we can use. And it's not just down to the individual. That was one of the things that, as we were talking about this and going through it, is so much of the support comes from the people around you. It comes from coming to something like this. It comes from being open to a new idea and sitting down saying, okay, how are we going to do this together? Like, we need that from each other to keep going. And then at the industry level, where I think we can do more, what the arts organisations in general do brilliantly, and the rest of the world needs to learn from, is tell stories. So like I was on the panels before, and just listening to the way you can share that vulnerability in those stories, so powerful. What you can help learn from the rest of the world is how to use data to back up those stories, and how to be able to go, here's what the data's telling, here's what the numbers are telling, and here's a story that brings that to life. So how can we use the data that we have to bring our story onto these other stages? And that's, I guess, the ask for all of us, and what we want, for everybody here today, is to go away going, look, this is a problem we should be able to solve together. There are tools in and outside of our organisations to bring this to bear. And if we do that, we can actually do something really great, not just for ourselves and not just for our industry, but also for the world of work, which is why I started Culture Amp. It's why you do what you do. That's a lot of what we're about. So I think on that context, I do believe that we're going to have to wrap. We don't have time for QA, do we? No, cool. So we're standing between you and lunch, which is usually a bad idea. You're going to be around a little while. I have to get on a plane almost straight away, but we'd love to chat to you more about how we can help and support, both from the Culture Amp lens and also Greta's from a research and other lenses as well. This is, as you said at the start, Greta, the beginning of a journey.
Yeah, totally. And if you have anything that you want to share with Dids, even though he's got a race, just come and grab me, and I will be sure to kind of thwack him over the head with all of your insights and ideas and suggestions. Thank you so much for listening.
See you at lunch.